This is 9 News.
Good evening and welcome to Nine's Late News. I'm Charles Croucher. More than 250,000 people on Sydney's northern beaches are tonight being asked to stay at home for 3 days. It is a serious escalation and affects residents stretching from the Spit Bridge to Palm Beach. A cluster there is exploding, jumping from 5 to 17 cases. That number is certain to rise. And tonight, other states are moving quickly too, imposing new restrictions. In breaking news, Western Australia is taking the drastic step of bringing back mandatory quarantine for travellers from New South Wales. In the last couple of hours, health ministers from across the country have been on a phone conference talking through their next step. We're across all of it for you. Our news team of 9 journalists are ready to bring us up to speed with what we know as we go to air. Let's begin with Bill Hogan, who's in Avalon. Bill, what is new there and what is the advice to residents there tonight?
Well, it's essentially to stay at home at all costs, Charles. Residents from suburbs spanning along the Spit Bridge in Mossman all the way to Palm Beach are told to be kept indoors for 3 days. Now, the official advice is this: do not go to the office, work from home, don't visit friends or relatives, especially at aged care facilities and hospitals. Any unnecessary gatherings, so cafes, restaurants, bars, clubs and churches, are all off the cards. Residents are also being told to avoid travelling outside the beaches if they can. This is simply so health authorities can limit the spread and begin the process of tracing the source of this mysterious case. And speaking to a number of residents who scrambled here when the news broke of this order, they are more than willing to abide and cop these long waits for the safety of the community.
We just don't want to be, if we are infected, just near anybody else that might be, so we just thought it was the right thing to do.
Got to nip it in the bud pretty early on and try and control it, yeah. So I'm not unhappy with that.
Now, Charles, I've also been told tonight that a number of other venues will be closed tomorrow. They include the Hardboard Diggers and Manly Bowling Club. Both are owned by the Mounties Group, as well as the Long Reef Golf Club and Restaurant. Now, they're closing tonight under the advice of health authorities because they are non-essential services. So at this stage, we can't confirm any links to any COVID clusters.
Yeah, Bill, it's heartening to see those big lines behind you for testing. Thank you. Well, Nine's Chris O'Keefe broke this story and he's still with us here at the desk tonight. Chris, how worried are authorities about the situation right now?
Yeah, well, it's a very, very serious situation, Charles. And I know for a fact that Brad Hazzard and his federal counterpart, Greg Hunt, have been having phone conversations and phone hookups with all the different health departments in New South Wales and the Commonwealth tonight. And they are looking at what happens tomorrow morning. So the big one will be, how many more positive cases do we get overnight after this testing blitz that we've seen on the northern beaches? Because we saw thousands and thousands of people from Palm Beach all the way down to Mossman coming out and getting tested, waiting to get tested. The only thing in our favour, I think, in Sydney at the moment, this is what's been relayed to me, is that we've seen the Avalon RSL and the Avalon Bowling Club, plus some of those venues where you knew that there was infectious people. Yeah. So you would see that every time that people came forward for testing, there was almost certainly someone in those venues that were also infectious with coronavirus. So if you can somehow put a ring fence those venues where you know that there were infectious people, it depends how much further it spread.
Yeah.
So if it's gone from the Avalon RSL and the Avalon Bowling Club to further into the northern beaches without a obvious connection, then you'll know you're in real trouble, and I think we'll probably understand that in the next sort of 14 to 24 hours.
There'll be a lot of people worried because this time next week is Christmas Eve. A lot of people have travel plans, particularly interstate travel plans. When will we get a call on that, and how in jeopardy are those plans?
I think they'd be pretty nervous.
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of people trying to jump on planes tomorrow morning to head to Queensland or Perth or even drive down to Canberra, and you can understand why, because we've lived through a pandemic since March that closing the borders has often been the first lever pulled by a premier, and the premiers don't have a whole lot that they can do when it comes to isolating themselves. But, geez, it's a hard call to say to people you can't come up to Queensland or go over to Perth for Christmas, but, you know, these premiers have form on this, and I think you'll see almost certainly the Northern Beaches local government area, that's 250,000 people. That is a lot of people. Yeah. that'll be almost certainly made a hotspot across the country. So their Christmas plans, if you live on the northern beaches or you've been there, they're up in the air for sure, and even summer holiday plans are up in the air.
Yeah, and in terms of the cluster size, it's grown so much. We're in an almost blessed situation where 17 seems like a lot. There's many countries that would kill for the chance to only have 17. How does this stack up against some of the other outbreaks we've seen both in New South Wales and across the country since the pandemic's been?
Well, New South Wales Health has been pressure tested when it comes to contact tracing and getting on top of these clusters. And as you said, you've got to put things into perspective, but not just from overseas, but what they've actually dealt with here in Sydney. So the Ty Rock cluster in Wetherill Park, that was 120 cases that ended up. The Apollo was more than 50. You said the City Tats, more than 50. So we've seen all this. And it wasn't that long ago where if we got 17 cases, you'd be like, that's a good day out.
Yeah.
But now the country and the citizens of Australia expect zero local transmission. We've seen this get out of hand today, and it depends how far and wide it's spread as to how much trouble we are in as a city.
Final question, any word on where it's come from or what the original source was?
Yeah, so they've run this genomics sequencing so they can see what strain it is. It is. I've been told it's been confirmed that it is an overseas strain, most likely from the United States. How it has slipped out of quarantine, that is the big question. And who was patient zero? That's the other one.
Big 12 hours, 14 hours, and then what comes next? Thanks for staying. And to show just how quickly things are moving right now, we're going to bring in Kelly Haywood, who joins us in Perth. There is breaking news there. Kelly, good evening. We understand mandatory quarantine is coming back.
Yeah, Charles, well, just half an hour ago, the WA Premier announced that from 12:01 a.m. tonight, Perth time, if you're coming from New South Wales into WA, you will have to go into 2 weeks quarantine and take a COVID test on arrival. Now, the Premier has gone into an emergency meeting tonight. He says he does not take this decision lightly, but he fears that this 17 cases that New South Wales has seen today is just the beginning. Now, as for everyone else that's travelling, if you've arrived after last Friday but before 12:01 a.m, you still need a COVID test on arrival, you still need a G2G pass, but you only need to go into quarantine for around 24 hours until you get that negative result back. Now, I spoke to a number of travellers today who are now under those circumstances. They didn't seem to mind too much. Take a listen.
It's not 14 days, okay, it's a one-day quarantine period. In that one-day quarantine period, you must be COVID tested, which you can do at the airport on the way through.
Now, there are 5 flights from Sydney to Melbourne tomorrow, and they are undoubtedly packed with people hoping to come over to WA for Christmas. So now they need to make that big decision as to whether or not they can cop 2 weeks quarantine. Charles?
Yeah, throws a lot of plans in jeopardy. Kelly, thank you. Queensland is staying open for now, but there are new rules tonight for anyone who's been to the northern beaches since December 11. You can't enter any of the state's aged care homes, hospitals or jails. The advice is changing for Queenslanders who intend on heading to Sydney. Residents urged to delay travel to New South Wales or Sydney for the next 24 hours. If they have to go, Queenslanders are being told to avoid the northern beaches altogether. Now to reporter Stephanie Anderson, who's at Melbourne Airport. Steph, you've just spoken to some pretty relieved passengers who were quick to touch down there before any changes in your state.
Yeah, I have, Charles. In just the past couple of hours, there's been 3 flights from Sydney arrive here in Melbourne, and there's definitely been a collective sigh of relief from those passengers on board. Many told me that they're actually keeping updated mid-flight, checking for any changes to the rules or requirements that may be waiting for them when they touch down here in Tullamarine. Here's what some of them had to say.
Yeah, it's good to be here before Melbourne made any drastic action, closing borders or anything. So, yeah, it's nice to be home.
Feels good. We were actually at the airport when we heard the news. So got on the plane, and by the time we're in the air, we knew we were away.
Tonight, the latest advice from Victorian authorities is that anyone who's been in Sydney's northern beaches since December 11 should be staying home and getting a COVID test as a matter of urgency tomorrow. But at this stage, there is no change to the restrictions around the Victorian-New South Wales border. That means it is still open. But tomorrow, there are more than 30 flights scheduled to arrive here in Melbourne from Sydney. So I'm told it's very much a situation that officials are closely monitoring. Charles?
We wait and watch, Steph. Thank you. Let's jump across to South Australia because Georgia Westgarth is in Adelaide. Georgia, what's the reaction been where you are?
Well, authorities are closely monitoring the situation and will reassess border controls if the spread continues. It comes less than a day after our road border checkpoints were removed, so police are no longer manning those, and screening at the airport was also just scaled back. Our Premier Stephen Marshall today said that SA Health will be watching this cluster very closely, and anyone travelling to or from New South Wales into South Australia is being asked to keep an eye on those changing advice.
Thank you. I'm going to go to breaking news overseas now because French President Emmanuel Macron has tested positive to COVID-19. Straight to Europe correspondent Ben Avery in London. Ben, the palace has just confirmed this news. What did it say?
Charles, it says that Mr Macron was tested immediately after showing symptoms earlier this week. Now, it won't say what those symptoms were, but it does appear that the 42-year-old at this stage can continue running the country. The statement from the palace at this stage is that in accordance with health regulations, the president will isolate for 7 days. However, he will continue to work and carry out his activities remotely. Now, the president has been forced to cancel a number of upcoming engagements, including a trip to Lebanon that was to take place on Tuesday of next week. Instead, he'll now be focusing on what's happening in France. Coronavirus still a massive problem. There was around 17,000 confirmed cases there in the last 24 hours alone.
And Ben, we understand the president's infection has caused concern for other top-level officials over there.
Charles, his office is now desperately looking to see who he's come into contact with in recent days. Already I can tell you that Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has gone into isolation after having lunch with the President on Monday. There are a number of other leaders, though, who he has met with, including the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and the Portuguese Prime Minister. So still waiting to hear whether or not people like that will now need to go into isolation. As for Mr Macron's wife, Brigitte, the 67-year-old, is now in isolation as well with the President, but we're told that at this stage she's showing no symptoms. Charles?
Ben Avery live in London. Thank you. Well, the worst-kept secret in tennis is confirmed tonight. Start date finally set for the Australian Open. The tournament has been officially penciled in to begin on the 8th of February, 3 weeks later than initially planned. Tennis Australia and the Victorian government are yet to comment, the news slipping only after the ATP released its revised 2021 calendar. The Federal Treasurer has warned that with the virus still with us, as we've seen tonight, anything could change. That's despite revealing the federal budget is in much better shape than was predicted just 2 months ago. Here's political reporter Emma LaRouche.
Charles, if there's one thing the government has learned from the COVID crisis, it's to expect the unexpected, as we've seen tonight. Last year's budget had forecast a return to surplus, the pandemic sending this year's budget into record debt. Today, the Treasurer delivered the mid-year budget update, with figures showing our economy is rebounding faster than anticipated. We are still expecting the record deficit for this financial year, but it has shrunk by $16 billion to $198 billion. This is due to Australia's iron ore price soaring over $200 a tonne and spending on JobKeeper $11 billion lower than expected. Josh Frydenberg, cautiously optimistic. The opposition quick to remind us the numbers are still deep in the red.
Australia is opening up and the recovery is underway, but the road ahead is challenging, very challenging. We have not yet defeated the virus. It still is with us.
Record deficits, a record $1 trillion in debt, weaker wages growth, almost 1 million unemployed.
As the year draws to a close, we are waiting on the Prime Minister to reveal an overhaul of his front bench, possibly tomorrow. Matthias Cormann's departure has seen Simon Birmingham take on the role of Finance Minister. Other changes are expected to be minimal, but we'll have to wait and see.
Emma LaRouche from Canberra. You're watching Nine's Late News right across Australia. We have breaking news from Queensland next regarding the Sydney COVID outbreak, and we hear from one of the infected patients. Their story coming up. Plus, there's a right way and a wrong way to do sunscreen. The new advice you need to know for summer. And we'll tell you how much a piece of Australian sporting history went for at auction tonight.